Hello and welcome to Badger Talks Live, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Riley Kuhn, a senior studying history, political science, and gender and women's studies in the UW College of Letters and Science. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for this special Wisconsin Public Radio edition of Badger Talks Live, to the best of our knowledge. Senior producer Shannon Henry Kleiber and author and Economic Hardship Reporting Project Executive Director Alissa Quart. Today, they will be having conversation about the connection between vulnerable people in the news, the reporters who tell their stories, and audiences seeking honest, respectful, and authentic coverage. Feel free to post your questions in the chat to be answered at the end of discussion. Please welcome Shannon Henry Kleiber and Alissa Quart.
Thank you so much, Riley. Really appreciate that introduction. So I wanted to start with just introducing me and Alissa and our podcast, and we're just happy to be here on Badger Talks. And I am part of the UW Madison, Wisconsin world. So Going for Broke, the podcast that Alissa and I have co-executive produced, is part of To the Best of Our Knowledge, which is a national show produced at Wisconsin Public Radio, which is on Madison, Wisconsin's campus. And we are part of the university. So not everybody knows that. So I like to always make that connection first. The show Going for Broke is a 3-part series on the care economy. And we focused on housing, mental health, and the workforce that is three parts that we struggle with a bit and also find a lot of meaning in. So we wanted to bring wonderful, interesting voices that otherwise might not be heard on public radio or commercial radio, or be seen in media in general, to our airwaves. So we produced this together as a partnership, and I'm a senior producer for To the Best of Our Knowledge, and my other background is in print journalism at the Washington Post, and I've written 2 nonfiction books. So I wanted to also now throw it to Alissa to just introduce herself a bit, and then we're going to give you a behind-the-scenes tour of how we put this show together.
Yeah, hey, so I'm Alissa Quart. Shannon, thank you so much. She's great to work with, as you can probably tell just from her short, pithy, and very warm introduction. So I run something called the Economic Hardship Reporting Project. I'm the executive director. I sort of built up its current incarnation with the great late Barbara Ehrenreich, and we support people who are financially struggling to write and photograph their own experience, as well as sort of more conventional reporters and photographers and filmmakers, including this show, to focus on income inequality as an issue. And to give shine a light on some of these stories and these people who are often excluded from American dialogue. So that was my goal with this. This is our 2nd season of Going for Broke. We have Ray Suarez, who's a great voice in American broadcast journalism, who had himself fallen on hard times. So that was the incentive actually to start the show. He had, during the pandemic, he was older, he lost his job, had an accident, didn't have dental care. And it was pretty shocking to a lot of people because he used to work at PBS and had been sort of like kind of Walter Cronkite-ish figure, honestly. That was how it all started. And I myself, I'm a reporter too. My 7th book is coming out. It's called Bootstrapped: Liberating Ourselves from the American Dream. Happy to talk about that as well. But that is one of the themes actually of this show, which is that we can't do it alone. We have to work together, and care can be put into everything from architecture to labor, to how we think about work, to how we think about journalism even. So that's what we're devoting this episodes to and this event to, and we really are excited to hear your questions.
That's right. Yes, Alissa, good point. So we'll take questions at the end, and we hope you'll have some, because we love answering questions, and it's fun for us to hear what people are thinking. So first, I also want to say Going for Broke can be found where you could find it if you'd like to listen to it, on any podcast feed. So if you look up To the Best of Our Knowledge, or if you look up Going for Broke, we have podcast feeds. You can find it and listen to all 3 of them. or streaming at ttbook.org, which is our website. So when we started to put together the show, we wanted to have, we put it together 3 hours, and we have 12 interviews. So each hour has 4 interviews. So it's kind of like when you put together a radio show or a podcast, it's like a puzzle. So you think about, what's your theme? Who do you want to talk to? How do they talk to each other when you have the hour? We have someone talking about how she moved 70 times as a child because of housing insecurity. And we have her wonderful story. And then we have someone who talks to that from a different perspective of an economy, like a really wide economy issue. David Harvey, who is a British economist and spatial architecture expert. So even though we're interviewing them, Ray Suarez is hosting, in some ways they're talking to each other as we get to the end of each episode, and we can kind of have echoes throughout of what each person says and how each person is telling their own story. Another thing we really wanted to do with the show is to have people listen to it and relate, and to really make sure we're listening to people and understanding this is not the other. This is something that we all have in common. We all have issues with work and mental health and physical health, and we need housing. And so this is something that's universal, and a huge part of the show was making sure you would listen and think, well, that person is not so different from me. This is not so different from my experience. So the overall theme, Alissa, how did we come up with that? I wanted to ask you, the care economy, how did we come up with that?
I think, I don't even remember. I mean, I think
we worked on this for a long time.
Yeah. So it's just like we were trying to come up with something that felt fresh, and that's something we can talk about a lot. Like, how do you make social justice reporting and reporting about economic strife not dreary? What kind of spin do you give it to get people to listen to it and actually keep yourself interested in it? Honestly, I've been doing this now for 10 to 15 years. And, I feel like I really did want to keep it exciting for listeners and viewers and readers. And care is kind of like, it's strange to say, care is kind of hot in intellectual circles. People are talking about, as we pointed out, care in architecture, instead of just thinking about the figure in a space, they're thinking about a figure that's disabled in a space, or multiple caregivers and people living in or working in nursing homes, let's say, and how Section 8 housing could have an element of care in it. So I think that was kind of exciting to me, and to see the new kind of care reporting. There's even care, what is it? Like someone with a care beat, right? That we found
at the 19th. Yeah.
At the 19th, which is daycare and caregiving. But more than that, it's a whole new kind of workforce, a new framing of a workforce. I mean, we obviously domestic work has always been here, but to see it as care work.
It's so interesting to think about, when you say care, it sounds like, oh, that's, being nice, but it's really deeper. It's empathy. And when you talk about the care economy, it really goes beyond the numbers. And I think Alissa and I, as journalists, we have reported business stories, financial stories, but when you bring personal stories in, you put a face on the story, you hear someone's voice, you understand where they're coming from. So that was a big thing in the care economy, covering it, but also how we as journalists took care, I think, in helping the people who have these stories tell their stories. And that was really cool, right? To hear their stories and to help them really voice what has happened to them.
Yeah. And, to believe in their voices in some ways, to like get their voices, their stories out of them in a inventive way. And like, you'll see when we start playing some of the clips, I think part of the problem with a lot of ways that we represent poverty and inequality in this country is that we don't let people speak in their own words. It's been interesting. Actually, I've been creating this database of experts called Working Sources, and I realized how many experts on disability are not disabled and how strange that is. And part of the project that we had with Going for Broke is to make people who are both experts and the thing in itself. We have somebody who is a former drug misuser, drug addict, who is a specialist in harm reduction. We have someone who has reported on homelessness, you'll hear, who also experienced homelessness, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that for us, that was very important, a way of reframing who gets to be the expert as well in this series.
Right. Our guests are experts and having the experience themselves, which is really powerful. So I think that's actually a great lead in to hearing some of the show. So we have two clips that we're going to play in this conversation. And the first one is from Alex Miller, who is in our second episode. And he is, we're going to talk about his experience a little bit after the clip, but let's hear his voice right now.
So I had a friend, and I was telling him, hey man, it's not going so well. Not really doing great in Florida. He's like, hey man, I got a spare bedroom. If you ever want to come up, why don't you just come up and get you a job and blah, blah, blah. You stay with me. We can just get you back on your feet. I didn't realize that it was a limited time only offer. I mean, I was out on my ass within the week. I was like, man, I'm trying. I'm going in different places, trying to get a job at Starbucks and McDonald's. And that's the best I could do. So, I have enough money for a hotel for like 2 days. And then I'm just completely homeless.
And clear the closing doors, please.
So we just heard from Alex, and it was an incredible experience interviewing him and having him on the show. And Alissa and I just did a live panel in Boston with Alex and another one of the guests, Maya Salovitz, and we really got to talk a lot about the, being a reporter and telling your own story and Alex's personal story. So Alissa, how did we find Alex, and tell us about how he came into our world?
So Alex had been writing, as a freelancer and had, some success and some, obstacles. He'd had editors who told him that his story of growing up in extreme trauma, being plucked out of school by his mother, who was severely mentally ill, having PTSD as a vet, that his writing wasn't good enough. He'd had all these obstacles he was trying to write while he was experiencing homelessness. And we caught up with him a little after that. He had written a piece about dating while homeless. And one of the editors who works for me at EHRP said, I found this guy and he's incredible. And at EHRP, Economic Hardship Reporting Project, we'd had a number of people who'd been unhoused writing for us. And every time they did, it was like a revelation for editors. Again, this is another thing with the expert and the participant observer. Very rare for stories about homelessness to be written by people who had experienced it. So when I heard his voice, his spoken voice, because I interviewed him too for a piece I wrote for CJR, I was like, this guy needs to be on audio or video. He's just got that kind of, and when we did an event with him, he's improvisatory. He's like a wonderful speaker as well. So I just knew if we're doing something on housing, this is the person who leads it, because he's got a lot of thoughts about it, about how people could be housed differently. And also if we do something on mental health, because he'd had PTSD, and experienced his mother's mental extremes, this is the person to talk about it. The VA had helped him, but it had also, he was still navigating his own mind all the time, and then without enough support. So yeah, that was how we came across him.
Yeah, I think it's really valuable to know too that he loves telling his story, and he's working on a memoir, which I think is really wonderful. And some of our other interviews in the show too, like Andrea Wagner, she is somebody who's legally blind, and she was having trouble getting a job because she couldn't see the person who was interviewing her, and she missed a handshake, and she wasn't making eye contact. And so she has this story about what it's like having an invisible disability and trying to get a job. And she really loves talking about it too, because she wants to help people who are having this experience. So, this is this power of experience and hearing the person's voice who's having this experience and giving them this platform that they might not otherwise be able to have. And then how do they influence people who hear them, who might be also having those issues or can relate to those issues?
Yeah, we've gotten some pretty moving emails around that. And I also want to say that part of what we achieved, I think, Shannon, had to do in the scripting and the approach to the interview. So we should probably share this, behind the curtain kind of stuff with our listeners. There's a way that people are always homeless. They're not unhoused. This is in mainstream reporting. People who are poor or unskilled rather than financially struggling or working class, right? There's a certain kind of language that's privileged that is sometimes derogatory or imprecise. And we were very careful with that. Like, people are just called mentally ill, harem scarum. And I prefer extreme mental states, because also someone may be mentally ill 1 month and then they get the treatment they need and they're not anymore. So I think we need to have a more complex, say they've experienced extreme mental states, say. So we sort of were very careful when we interviewed people, but also when we wrote about them and named them. So that seemed important to me. I actually call this poor reporting, in the sense, when it's poorly done, that is, in both senses, because there's a kind of objectification and otherization in the language that reporters use when they write about poverty, often, not all the time, and to really think about that, we're aware of the language around certain identity groups and not others, we don't think about mental health in the same way as we might think of other derogatory language. So yeah, that was an interesting project for us. And I think part of what we want to do also is to kind of reorient ourselves about what being so-called normal is. Mm-hmm. When you listen to these people in our show, and again, because they're experts and experiential experts, they've lived it and they know it at the same time. I think it changes. It changed for me, and it changed for listener what normal means. And I had first thought of this when I wrote my third book, Republic of Outsiders, which was very much about, I call them mental outsiders. They were people who had neurodiverse, they were on the ASD, autism spectrum, or they'd experienced mental extremity. And so I thought, when we came to this show, this episode, it was like, let's treat it like this. And, you guys did a masterful job, honestly.
Well, and this is a lot of what Alissa and I thought about as we were doing this was, we talk about recovering the care economy, but how do we really authentically take care in these stories? And they're vulnerable people, and they're people who are sharing their stories with us. They're trusting their stories with us. So how do we, use the best journalistic ethics to have them tell their own story, to still also fact check? I mean, we talk about sometimes, there were very typical journalism things we did in this about fact checking and things like that, but also, how is this person feeling, and do they want to share this, and which parts are we, how are we helping them tell the truest, best story that will help others and help themselves? And I think we took a lot of time with it. I think each interview took a lot of emotional energy for us and for people we were interviewing, because we felt a big responsibility in sharing their story and how it came out. And I think that some of what we're hearing now from listeners is really interesting about how some of these stories have influenced them to do something different in their lives, or understand something in a little bit of a different way.
But also, I mean, I think you guys put in sound, you had the kind of like artisanal quality around some of this, like the subway doors closing in the segment we just listened to. And that's something that is familiar from people who listen to This American Life and, obviously your show, but it's not often put into these kind of gritty kind of stories about social justice. They don't have that level of flair, and that's, which brings me to like the other things that we were looking for when we put the show together. We didn't want it to be depressing or downer. And so we're going to address two of the ways that we tried to prevent that. And the first is solutions. We wanted to offer solutions that were not just like glib, aw shucks, like, here's a straw to clean water. Because there's something about a certain kind of solution that can be important, but also very micro. So we were interested in kind of major big thinking solutions brings me to Justin Garrett Moore, who you interviewed, who was somebody we really were looking hard for, somebody who had thoughts about different kinds of housing solutions. So if you could talk about that a little, that'd be great.
Right. Yeah. Like Alissa said, there's a lot, it could be a very, really depressing if you think about it, topic. I mean, but we wanted to have hope. We wanted to have solutions. We wanted to have meaning and, and emotion in it. So the solutions were really important. Justin Garrett Moore is an urban architect in New York who has this idea that cities should have departments of care. And I interviewed him for the show, for our episode on housing. And he talks about these departments of care as being kind of this, these networks, like underground tree roots that go through every part of a city, Department of Transportation, Department of, Public Works, Department of Water, that, for instance, the subway system would have care, in accessibility, in different ways that people with strollers or wheelchairs could get on. Other areas would have green spaces, beautiful spaces. So he's not saying, okay, everybody needs this like specific thing and it's just utilitarian. He's thinking bigger and broader, that we need to have beautiful spaces. We need to have safe spaces in housing. And he's pretty groundbreaking, I think, in the way he is working towards this, because he has these big, interesting thoughts, but he's also in the position of being able to make them happen. So he is working on some pilot programs where a Department of Care is in the works, and the ideas within a Department of Care within the works. Another person we talked to is Angela Garbez, who is this wonderful writer in Seattle, who's written two books. The one we focused on was about the work of motherhood. And she talks about caregiving, both in taking care of children and parents, as being the most vital work of our lives, and how underpaid, underappreciated it is. But let's understand that what it really is, and give thanks, and give money, and give support to people who are taking care of our society. And this is part of, I know, Alissa's philosophy of mutual aid, and of, Alissa and I are both mothers, of how you need help. Like, we do actually need help in our society as we're taking care of other people.
Yeah, and an example of that too is Maya Solovitz, who spoke a lot about harm reduction, and this sort of wild moment, really, of mutual aid, when I can't remember if the woman was an active user or not, but it's in our show, had told her in the 1980s that they were both injecting drugs, and that Maya should bleach her needles. And at that point, that was news, that she could get AIDS, HIV, if she didn't, or hepatitis. And that moment changed Maya's life. and led her to believe in this philosophy, which is connected to mutualism, called harm reduction, which is, that we don't have to have complete abstinence from, in her case, from, she'll have a glass of wine kind of thing. But for many other people, it's they continue to use their own methadone. And it's more complicated than just, cold turkey. And the value of harm reduction in other contexts can be some of the things we're talking about. Support, kind of, say, a UBI for moms that would be supporting parents who are this kind of, the mothers particularly, who are in visible labor. That is a program that has actually, at this point, I think actually been piloted. But that, to me, that would be an example of harm reduction, because you're not going to get rid of the lack of infrastructure in this. That's not, we have a lack of infrastructure around daycare in this country. We have 0.5% of our GDP goes to it, right? It's very low. But you can, say, give somebody $1,500, $1,000 a month for daycare. So that would be another example of harm reduction. Mutualism in that context, in the care economy context, might be, people caring for each other's kids. And we saw a lot of that in the pandemic, right? We had pods, remote schooling, kind of the normalization of that kind of care economy that wasn't exactly about money. It was about in-kind services that people were doing for each other on a voluntary level. But the other thing that we really emphasize to try to give this show a spark, which I hope you guys think it does, but it's so funny, it's so thoughtful, and everyone's like, but no, yeah, but like the is humor and something. So yes, fresh solutions, grave and profound solutions, but also humor and unusual ideas. And one of the things that brings to mind is Annabelle Gurwitch, who was a comedian who had taken in an unhoused couple. And we thought that really added something. And the treatment that we gave it, well, Shannon can talk about that, added something too. There's like piano in it. Do you want to talk a little bit about Annabelle's portion?
Sure, yeah. So she, like Alissa said, the humor part was important to us because we wanted people to feel as they were listening to the 3 hours in different ways. And Annabelle's story is profound, but she's also very funny. She's been on Seinfeld, and she was going through a hard time financially herself. She'd been through a really tough divorce, and she found out about a program where she could take in unhoused people, and she took in this young couple, and she tells the story about how she hid her valuables, and then she finds out later they hid their valuables. And it really, it's kind of like a again, not that different from each other experience, she realized, and she's become really good friends with them. But so she just tells this kind of really surprising and interesting story. And Alex Miller, who you just heard too, tells his story of dating while homeless, which it's when you hear him talking about it, I mean, he's got such a great storytelling ability, and how he kind of tried to keep it secret, that he didn't have a place to take his date back to. But you hear these things and you're like, wow, this person sees this other world in their experience, and then you might relate to it. So that emotion in the sound is really important. And we're going to talk about sound a little bit later, but how we designed those. And we have an incredible sound designer and technical director on TT Book, Joe Hardkey, who is really a genius in creating these sound moments that have pacing, they have emotion, they are like chapter turns in a book, really.
Yeah. And, that was an interesting tonal moment with Annabelle, because, I was a little worried we were all a little worried, she's making jokes about unhoused people and her own phobia around people who were young and had chaotic lives too. They were kind of covered tattoos, etc. But in the end of the day, I think people really responded to that. They found the humor and the because you'll see if you listen, she turns around, obviously, her sense about it, but listeners identified, and it sort of spoke directly to their fears when listening to something like this, which is something that I think is important for us to address when we're creating kind of social impact programming, that you have to recognize that there is, I don't know, bigotry, but there's moments of fear in a lot of people's lives around those who have experienced homelessness. So demystifying these people is really important, and addressing that they need to be demystified, right? Not just being like, oh, of course you're going to have no fear, and of course, and one other thing that I thought was really important was how we handled this, the last segment of our program, Shannon, which was also kind of had some moral elements, like ethical elements, like obviously how we treated the people who experience homelessness in our show had moral complexity, ethical complexity. The program, the last taping was of Barbara Ehrenreich, and we had tape of her at that point. She's a legendary labor reporter, legendary writer, had been bedridden. She was in sort of not great physical health. She was already, I guess, 80. And her caregiver was helping her turn on the Zoom, partially because she was in bed, but also because she was not very technologically savvy. So, but it was like, do we include that woman doing this? And that was an interesting debate. And we're happy to talk about that. Like, is that a great example of care, or is that kind of mixed messaging? So that's something that we can talk about. Yeah,
and including Barbara Ehrenreich, who died in September. So we had a plan to interview her for this show, and then really sadly, I mean, especially for Alissa, who knew her so well, and I mean, they were really very close. What should we do with the tape we had? And that was, I would say, Alissa, don't you think, probably our biggest question of the entire project of, how do we do right by Barbara? How do we put her in the show after she's gone, which was really, who would have expected that to have happened, right?
I really want to make a set of t-shirts with her face on it, like, what would Barbara Ehrenreich do? like what would Jesus do? But yeah, like, so that was the question, like, what would Barbara Ehrenreich do with her own, we don't know if it's her last, but definitely one of her last serious interviews. And would she want that to be, was it good enough? Because I had taped it with a different producer, and again, it wasn't high quality. We'd done it on Zoom because she couldn't figure out how to use Zencaster and all the other kind of stuff, and couldn't figure out how to use a mic. And so, was it sound good enough? Was the content strong enough? Did it reflect her? And what was in the public good, and what was just us putting her in for no good reason. So I think that was our debate. And also, and then you actually went through and did an edit that was fantastic. I was like shocked that you'd found that it was great. I was like, this is what the collaboration was like. And we can talk a little bit about how nonprofit collaborations can be so additive, because working with this team has been like wildly interesting and exciting and helpful. And everybody talks about that collaboration. That's like a byword, like care in some ways, but we've experienced it firsthand. That was her looking at the listening to the raw footage and getting this really great material out of it. So
at this emotional moment. So I think that would be a great moment to, let's hear a little clip from the Barbara Ehrenreich piece, and then we'll talk a little more about it after.
We marched to the Pentagon together. We marched to Washington over and over. We met till late at night in student apartments and at Columbia University. We were, however vaguely, we were a collective. We were learning from each other, and we were learning from revolutions around the world. In the 60s and 70s, all these things just electrified us.
In coming years, we'll surely be hit with new American emergencies. I wish Barbara would still be here, helping me make sense of them.
We are really at a potentially fatal turning point. Either we go toward fascism, and I don't use that word lightly, or we could say, we can't go on like this. This is crazy. No more, no more. Let's take care of those who are hurting right now.
So we just heard from Barbara Ehrenreich, and she was the last segment of the last part of the show. So it was the very ending, and Alissa narrated that part of it. So if you listen, you'll hear more of Alissa and Barbara together in that piece. And Alissa, how did you end up thinking about how it turned out?
I mean, I love it. When we had interesting conversations, like we put sound effects, and when you've lost somebody, like, I had just lost her and I cared for her so much, and I just, oh, that's too much, but at the same time, there was sound that I think was really powerful, ambient sound and music. And that sort of brings us to one of the things we were talking about, like sound in the earlier episodes, like the subway doors closing in the Alex Miller segment, raw sound when we're taping Rodrigo and Opus 40, on an audience responding to him. And other sound that was created for Bobby Dempsey, Katie Prout, etc. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so one of the things we created together was this idea that we would have one field piece, as we call it in radio, in each episode. And that was to create a sense of place. And we wanted to have some in-studio interviews, but the sense of place was very important too, as you're listening to it. So in the first episode, Bobby Dempsey, who's the woman who had moved 70 times, still lives kind of near one of her grade schools. And so I said, well, what would it be like if you went there and recorded yourself coming out of the school and how you felt? And so at the very beginning of the first episode, we hear her imagining her young child life, not knowing which way to walk out of her school because her housing was so unstable as a child that she could not remember where she lived when she was leaving her school every day. And I just thought that was so powerful to say, as a, how you experience homelessness affects, where your mail is sent, where, your new friendships, just kind of things that you don't automatically think about. And she created that, she recorded that herself. And then our amazing sound designer, Joe Hardkey, helped make it into really a beautiful story. And then in our second episode, Mark Rickers, our digital producer, did an incredible piece interviewing Katie Prout, who was going through some OCD issues, and she would walk along Lake Michigan in Chicago, so urban Lake Michigan, and pick up rocks, and she would bring home just so many rocks. It was just kind of this coping mechanism. But then her partner was saying, well, what's the deal with these rocks? And so we had this idea that Mark would walk with her along the shore and look at rocks and talk. And it's just a lovely, lovely piece. And then the third episode, which is about work, I went to upstate New York to Opus 40, which is this incredible testament to work and art, sculpture, just amazing place if you've ever heard of it or been there. In the Catskills, and a poet named Rodrigo Toscano was there for this larger poetry event that Alissa was at too. And he read his poems, but he's also a labor organizer. So he has this intersection of labor and work and art that was really interesting to tie together. And so we had some sound of, the mic check and the audience and the clapping and the reaction, and that kind of gave you a sense of place.
Yeah. And I mean, the beauty of sound helps us get at emotion. And I think we wanted to, before we get your questions, talk about the emotional piece a little, because I always say empathy is my metric. And I feel like people understand other people's experience sensually, through our senses. And interested in immersion reporting, in the sense that the reporting of people who have lived some of these things, but also the immersion of our our ears and our eyes. And that's one thing that I feel like the sound did wonderfully in the show. But also, what it sounds their heart. And how do we get to people's hearts when we're so inundated with information? We live in this flooded attention economy where people are they have, compassion fatigue. Mm-hmm. And so I think the thing was to sort of play into the emotional truths, the universal truths of some of these stories. A lot of people have lived in lots of different houses, right? So this is one way to explain the story of a domestic violence survivor who's moved to different homes, right? But it's tapping into the emotion that maybe a listener might have about having had an unsettled childhood. I mean, I think a lot of people can identify with that. Or listening to Barbara, you might think about your own elder, and the wisdom that they might have to share. So that was part of our project with that. I think, Dan Bergner talked about his brother having these, extreme mental states. And again, it was something that was very emotional. One of our team who did the interview choked up. He himself had been experienced, I don't know exactly what his mental health crisis had been, but he had his own bouts with mental illness, mental extremes, let's put it. And he chokes up, and that is getting at the emotion and not shying away from it and not saying, oh, we're just about stats here. We're just about information, but no, we're about, touch, sound, hearing, feeling.
Alissa, that's so well put. Yes. And as reporters, both of us, I think it's one of our passions is to bring the emotion into the stories. And I've written so many business stories where, you have to write the numbers and the numbers are interesting and data is interesting, but, there's stories behind data, there's stories behind numbers, and there's people's lives behind numbers and behind data. So this was really our goal in this radio show and in this podcast, to bring the meaning and the emotion of really what being on the edge of the economy is like. And, I think that we had a surprising and wonderful experience producing it too.
Yeah, very much so. So I think we're ready now to take your questions, this is always my favorite part, Shannon.
I love questions.
Yeah. It's the element of surprise. It's so cool. Like what are people going to want to know about? So what do we have?
So I see the first one on here on the chat is each episode one person's journey or story? So there's 3 episodes and there's 3 themes. So the first episode is about housing, the second is about mental health, and the third is about work. And then each episode has 4 interviews. So there's 4 people, 4 voices in each episode. So 12 stories, really. 12 personal stories in each in the whole show, in the whole in the whole series. So it's 12 more than one. Yeah.
But I'd say there's 2 kind of searing emotional stories per episode. I think that's fair, right? And then 2 sort of slightly more detached. I mean, they might be given a cool sonic treatment and they might be profound, but they're not like, I've been homeless or I've been, right. It's like slightly different. So I'd say, I don't know, for maybe 6 journeys and 6 journeys of the self, and then 6 journeys of the mind, maybe.
Interesting. Yeah. And each episode does start with a very personal journey. So that's kind of the way we're trying to bring you in. Right.
So the next question is, to what degree did you find that your interviewees were unaware of existing resources that would really help them versus those resources being non-existent? Oh, I love this. I don't know. What would you say about? I mean, it's complicated, right? I think probably when Bobby Dempsey was going from house to house, there was not a lot of resources for children who were victims of domestic violence. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I know that's the case. She may not have tapped into the resources that exist now for someone who's like recovering from that. But there's certainly when this show was sort of, that episode was kind of interestingly retrospective because it was about her early experience and how it has had an effect on the rest of her life. So yeah, I don't think there are a lot of resources then, or a lot of awareness, honestly, about what domestic violence did to families.
We have a question from Jeff M. Did you find people in rural as well as urban areas, and any difference between the two? You know, that's an interesting question, because one of our goals too was to make it geographically diverse. So we have a lot of diversity in the show, and we have some New Yorkers and one person from LA and one person from Seattle, but then we also have someone in rural Pennsylvania. We have someone from Alabama, from New Orleans. I'm forgetting some of the others, right? But the idea is geographically diverse.
Yeah, New York and Los Angeles as well, but like not just New York and Los Angeles,
Right.
like very committed to trying to get regional diversity.
Right.
So I'm trying to think tonally whether there was a huge difference. Maybe there was less self-consciousness, like media self-consciousness in some of the more rural subjects. You know, maybe it was the first time they'd ever intersected with the media, versus like Annabelle Gurwitch, who has been on Bill Maher and all this kind of thing.
Yeah. So some of the people we interviewed really have never been, their voices have not been aired before. So maybe that would be
and they were really people like Bobby, who came from a rural background, and Andrea, who came from a rural Southern background, for instance, just to name two.
Right.
Question from Fran. Is that the next, or yes? Can you tell us what inspired you to choose the career you have chosen? Fun. Shannon, what inspired you?
So to choose the career we've chosen. So when I graduated from college, I got really lucky, and I moved back to my hometown of Washington, D.C. And I got a job at NPR, and I was I was somebody's assistant. I was not on the air or being a reporter yet, but I was kind of in the midst of telling stories at NPR. And I got really, really inspired there early on, and then went back to graduate school to do a master's in journalism at American University, and then became a print journalist for many years. So I think talking to people has inspired me, trying to understand the world better. I mean, there is this idea of social justice that I think is really interesting. I mean, can we make the world more feel like we're all in it together? I love it when I do a piece and someone says, "Oh, that helped me," or "I related to that." So those kinds of feelings are very inspiring to me.
Yeah, I started out as a poet, and then I went to graduate school in English literature. So yeah, I was not expecting to become a reporter, although I sort of decided pretty early, oh, this is what you can do. You know, I didn't come from money. I was like, I need to make a living doing this. And at that point, actually, this was the mid to late 90s. People were still paid in the magazine industry $2 a word. They were getting book advances that are similar to what people get now. So it was a feasible idea. Like, I wasn't just being self-destructive, but my joke is always, I would have been a voyeur if I hadn't been a reporter, because I was so interested in other people's lives. And that is, and probably you were too, Shannon. I mean,
I would joke I wanted to be a detective, an archaeologist, or a reporter. Which right. There's something similar there. Yes. Yeah.
Like I'd visit people, and I'd get to know people just to look at their, house and to understand like their story. And I was like, oh my God, I could get paid to do this, and it would be legitimate, and people wouldn't be like, this person is like antisocial. Or like, I'd want to know everything about them when I first met them. They'd be like, oh, but she's a reporter. So I was like, okay. So that was sort of, for me, that was my journey. And then, my first book came out when I was like 30, or not quite 30. And yeah, that was sort of where it all began for me. I became an author then, and as my first book was on teenagers and consumerism. And I did the never been kissed thing where, I went undercover I still could pass. And I went into like a high school as a student. It was like a lot of the things that continue to interest me, like what made an adolescent an adolescent? How could I connect to them? How could I get a reader to connect to them? So these are the three kind of things.
I also had a background in poetry.
Yeah.
I studied poetry, and also it's like, well, I still love poetry, but
yeah.
Yes.
I was like, I'm not that self-destructive to be a poet. I can't.
You are a poet. Yeah.
I am a poet. I still write poetry. I write poetry, but I couldn't devote myself. And I mean, I do think that the cool thing that we share, Shannon, is we really love the things people say and like the poetry of everyday language. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is having been trained as a poet and a reader of poetry, and then as a journalist.
Poetry of life. Yes.
Poetry of life. That would be my main thing that I'm looking for. The quote so that gets me to Mark's question. Was there anything people said that we remember on a daily basis? And I have to say, for me, it's Barbara, when she said, we peel people off the floor. And she's talking about our organization. And so I obviously do that work on a daily basis, but that phrase, I guess it inspires me if I feel like I have a particularly tough case, or I can't sell, we co-publish at EHRP, we co-publish at work with mainstream publications, including, right, you guys, the Wisconsin Public Radio, but also all kinds of like women's magazines and, the New York Times. And, if there's a particularly complicated co-publishing situation, I'm like, I am an advocate. I have to peel the story and the person off the floor. if something's falling apart, I have to make it. So that I found that very inspiring. The things that she said about labor and how to take care of workers, how workers can take care of themselves, how journalists should be taken care of. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think of all of these voices a lot, when you have done the interviews and then you edit we're physically editing and sound waves, and you cut things, and they're in your head, these interviews. So they're really in my head. I guess I would say I think about Rodrigo Toscano's thoughts about a lot, probably because I did that interview, and I just think about the intersection of art and work, and how people who are artists have the right to meaningful and paid and appreciated work, and how hard that is for a lot of people who are artists or trying to make a living supporting themselves and their families, and doing something that's meaningful to them too. So I think a lot about that. There's a question from KJ. What do you mean when you use the phrase tonally in terms of describing the series or in specific interviews?
I think I use the phrase tonally. I think you can make tonal mistakes. I don't mean tone as in like room tone or sound in that sense. I mean tonal and the quality in which you're treating a subject or a topic. You can make errors that are like, as I said, like objectifying someone, making doing a program about somebody who's sibling was extremely mentally challenged, and doing it in a way that makes that person's sibling sound just subhuman. There's things that journalists do are under the guise of neutrality that can be very derogatory, honestly, and not respectful of people who are outside of the mainstream. So I think when I talk about tone, I'm just saying, how do you keep the tone so it enshrines people, it complicates them, but it doesn't humiliate them, and it gives them space. And then also, if we're trying to be funny, as we say, humor doesn't go over that line. And that was a challenge with the Annabelle piece, I think, was like, is this going to go over the line? I think, what was it that we took out? Because some of these subtle things are actually indicative of tone, right? What was it? Do you remember?
Yeah, she does make people feel uncomfortable, which I think is okay too, because it stirs something, which I think
There's
is
something
okay.
she said that we were like, oh no.
Well, and she's also there are a few things that I think like she's trying to be provocative, so which is fine. But also you want to be respectful and ethical and careful in telling people stories too. So I think that's that tone is important, that we're taking this seriously, even though we're having humor as a tone.
This is a mass media, right? Like even if it is public radio, what, tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people have listened to this, and it's going to hit them in different ways. So you don't want to have a tone that's too open to interpretation, where someone would be like, oh, like super offended or hating your subjects unless they deserve it. You have to kind of, and that's an interesting part of the journalism process is, not hanging your sources out to dry, unless they're, Steve Bannon. So, yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question. Do you have tips or advice for student journalists who are interested in covering the stories of unhoused people living in their campus community? Which is a great question. And I love hearing that people are becoming journalists and young students becoming journalists and interested in this field. I think I would start with what you would do as an ethical journalist in any way is make sure the person you're interviewing knows exactly who you are, how you're using it, where you're coming from. You're really, identifying yourself. And then I think I would take your time with it. I know this sounds like, we have deadlines as journalists, but if we're really trying to tell someone's story carefully and authentically, probably need to talk to them more than once, probably need to do some research, probably need to get to know other parts of the community to understand how this person became unhoused, how this happened. So not really thinking of their story in a void, but as a whole. And sometimes, you're on deadline and, you run out of time, but, I think sometimes you need to give yourself some time to really understand someone's personal story. So I would go with those two to start.
There's 640, I think, campus food pantries in this country last time I checked. So if I was a student, my first thing to do would be to go to the on-campus food pantry and to start asking around about other students who may be experiencing homelessness, because it is horribly, it's a commonplace on campus. And you as a student would have a specific insight into one of your fellow students' experience. And like, just as somebody who would be then trying to write something evocative, you'd probably do a better job, honestly, than an adult, professional reporter, because you're part of this community. You have easier access to their friends, and you could probably get the attention of the college quicker about this problem. So that, to me, that would be the first thing I would do.
Sounds great. Well, I think that we might be running out of time, but we want to thank you so much for joining us. And Fran Playa-Moyer from Badger Talks, thank you so much for inviting us. And, Alissa and I had a great experience producing Going for Broke, and we appreciate all of you joining us today and hope you'll take a listen.
It's great. It was great to be here. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you for watching this Badger Talks live event produced by the University of Wisconsin-Madison through UW Connect's outreach and the Office of State Relations. Follow us on Facebook and YouTube to see the library of past recorded talks. Please visit badgertalks.wisc.edu to see the schedule of upcoming talks, sign up for the Badger Talks email list, and search the roster of over 400 UW experts who are available to give talks on important issues in your Wisconsin community.
One of the great surprises about UW and about Wisconsin when you come here is the Wisconsin idea that education should influence people's lives beyond the boundaries of the classroom, beyond the boundaries of the state, beyond the boundaries of the country. That's just very exciting to hear that spoken. The other thing that we value here at UW is diversity as a source of strength and creativity and innovation, and how understanding others who are different than ourselves broadens our worldview and makes us more competitive in the job market.